My name is George Galloway, presenter of Kali Mahorra on Al Maidan television. Morning to you. I don't mince my words. I speak Kali Mahorra, and my audience does too. Kali Mahorra, free word, free for me, free for you. Catch it. Nice to meet you, brother. Welcome to Kali Mahorra with me, George Galloway, on Al Maidan television, coming to you from London, but discussing Ukraine. Not yesterday in Ukraine, but the beginning of the war in Ukraine, which was not 12 months ago, as most commentators, indeed much of the public, imagine that it began. It began in the Maidan. In the Maidan coup or the Maidan revolution, according to your taste. The United States and the European Union were deeply involved in the events of 2014 in Kiev, the capital of the Western Ukrainian State, as it will almost certainly now be remembered as. The uprising that took place there was no doubt in part genuine, but it was equally in no doubt part confected by the EU and the US, although the US plenipotentiary then, one Victoria Newland, who pops up extraordinarily often in the Ukraine story, and not just in the Ukraine story. She famously said, F the EU. At that point, the EU was acting as something of a brake on events in Ukraine, whereas now they are entirely subservient to the US line, still being piloted by the very same Victoria Newland. Her telephone calls with putative ministers in the new Ukrainian government were recorded, captured, and can be heard on social media even today, as she discussed who would be the Prime Minister, who would be the Finance Minister, who would be the Defense Minister, and so on. Myself, I believe that the events in Ukraine started even earlier than 2014. And we have the word of Stoltenberg, the head of NATO, to buttress my point of view. He says that the NATO was involved in the Ukraine as far back as 2008. And I could, if I wanted to, go back even further than that. But the events in 2014, henceforth known as the Maidan or EuroMaidan, were everywhere to be seen on television. It's not a surprise when I tell you that the Ukrainian parliament was set ablaze, the president put to flight, the members of the parliament held at gunpoint, forced to vote at gunpoint for a whole raft of new laws, the most significant of which was the very first. And that very first was a law relegating the Russian language, which was spoken, oftentimes the sole language spoken, by up to 1/3 of the Ukrainian population. The deracination of the Russian citizens of Ukraine, the delegitimizing of their language, their culture, which has now led to the burning of millions of Russian books as a kind of bizarre echo of the German Nazi burning of books in the 1930s, is, if you like, the end point of that particular story. But the banning of the Russian language, the relegation of the Russian-speaking people in the east of Ukraine into second-class citizenship was the beginning of the events which have led us to where we are today in the Ukraine. Russia quickly moved to secure Crimea, where even American television in their recent reportage have conceded that the vast majority of the people of Crimea consider themselves Russian and are happy to be back under Russian sovereignty. But Russia had used the Crimea as an important naval base, of course, for centuries. In fact, before the United States itself even existed. So the idea that Russia was going to allow the Crimea to be held hostage by an explicitly anti-Russian government in Kiev was always fanciful. The war rages on. Hundreds of thousands of people have lost their lives. Many more have lost their limbs and their blood and their mind as a result of a conflict still raging in the heart of Europe. And it often seems like the US and European Union will fight to the last drop of Ukrainian blood. At least that's my point of view. But as always, I'm merely the enthusiastic amateur here. I'm joined by a group of distinguished experts, the first of whom, Robert Oles, a distinguished figure, a regular guest of the show, is from the Bruges Group. The Bruges Group is a section of, if you like, conservative opinion in Britain, particularly interested in the past in getting Britain out of the European Union. But they still keep a very close eye on European events. And as it happens, Robert is something of an expert in this part of the world, Ukraine. Robert, the summary I gave is my own summary, of course. If you differ with it, please say, and if you don't, please deepen it.
Well, you referred to what's known as the EuroMaidan, the rebellion against Yanukovych, the elected president of Ukraine, who was democratically elected in what is acknowledged to be a free and fair election by international observers in 2010. Of course, you described it as a coup or a revolution. Really, a better word, perhaps, is putsch, considering the people that took part, many of which who did the fighting. Of course, there were ordinary citizens involved, but most of them were really armed extremist groups that would be described as far-right or indeed neo-Nazi in terms of their politics. Many of them indeed are. They are nothing that we would sort of consider to be mainstream in Western Europe. They are part of Ukraine's long tradition of allying with the most unpleasant factors in European politics, which is something that's not unknown in the country. And this really began against the elected president because he delayed signing an agreement he had actually negotiated with the European Union, which is to have an association agreement, which is a trade agreement with the EU. He knew that wasn't popular in the east of the country, that had close economic links with Russia, where most of the industrial exports of the Donetsk basin, the Donbass, would go to Russia, where they have the markets for the trains produced there and the raw materials. And he knew that he had to have an agreement as well with Russia. Russia wanted its own agreement with Ukraine. Earlier, they had tried one with the EU. They wanted their own agreement with Ukraine, the Eurasian Customs Union, which was a trade bloc. And somehow he knew that Ukraine had to be, in a sense, neutral and have an agreement with both the European Union and its Russian neighbour. Without doing so would cause problems. The European Union and the United States funded this putsch, drove it, encouraged it. There was foreign leaders going to Kiev to whip up this revolt.
We're actually in the square.
Absolutely, yes. It was quite shameful. A democratically elected president actually being actively overthrown by foreign powers, absolute interference. And of course, it was always obvious that Russia would react. That was quite clear to me at the time. I warned people who were encouraging this revolution, this coup, this putsch, that of course Crimea would be next. They needed to consider that Ukraine itself is a divided country between part of the population which are admittedly vehemently anti-Russian and have a different outlook for their country, but a large part of the population, particularly people in the east and the south, from Odessa, which is close to Moldova, going across the Black Sea coast, the Sea of Azov and Russia, are of course identify as Russian and speak Russian as their main language. And without having an agreement with both, there would always, both the European Union and Russia, and the Eurasian Customs Union, crisis would always follow. And that's indeed what happened. Nobody in the East wanted Yanukovych overthrown, so it was a deliberate interference and people should have known better. And I suspect they did know better because people wanted to whip up this conflict in the hope of trying to extinguish the Russian influence in their country, both politically and, of course, ethnically, in terms of the culture, the Russian culture and the Russian identity and the Russian language, and even the Russian Orthodox Church, which most people in Ukraine would have subscribed to. They would have acknowledged the authority of the Moscow Patriarch. They have then since created the Ukrainian Church, which is a pure creation of, in a sense, high politics pushing this, all in this sense of creating this Ukrainian identity, which existed for some, but for most people it is, or many people at least in the east of the country, a modern invention, something which is directed at them, not something they can join into. It's something they have to be in a sense, be ashamed of. And people in the east would lose out culturally and economically as a result of the trade and association agreement with the EU, which they certainly have. It's led to the IMF coming in, it's led to austerity measures, whereas, of course, Russia was actually offering a lot of money to Ukraine to actually have an agreement with them. And that would possibly be more logical. It certainly wouldn't have led to the bloodshed that we see now.
Quite so. Edward Reynard, you're the National Secretary of the Workers' Party of Great Britain. What line do you take on these events? Coup, revolution, or indeed, as Robert says, putsch, which is something less than a coup?
Thank you for having me, George. I agree with Robert. It's a putsch. It's a manufactured putsch in large part. I agree with what you said earlier, George. You know, there are some in Ukraine who desired it, but they were an ultra-nationalist, a fascist far-right. But that fascist far-right didn't come out of a vacuum. It burnt away at the fringes of Ukrainian society, because after the collapse of the Soviet Union, you had a country which was a modern country, had a modern manufacturing base. And since that time, 1991, Ukraine had 52 million people living there, and that's shrunk by 10 million people now. There's a brain drain, and despite that brain drain, despite that outing of the labour population, the young population and the working population, you still have a population which has 10% unemployment. So there's plenty to be unhappy with. And that's where the fascist groups that you've both referred to found their market.
And they come from a historical base also.
Yes.
The nationalists in Ukraine were the collaborators of Hitler in the occupation.
Absolutely, absolutely. And they were resuscitated, or Stepan Bandera, who you're referring to, was resuscitated as a figure actually before 2014. Yushchenko, the president before Yanukovych, resuscitated him at the very end of his term, just before 2010. Now, of course, Yushchenko himself was a puppet and ally of the West, not Russia, primarily. But Russia, you saw at that time, did not intervene within the borders of Ukraine. What you did see at the beginning of was the encroachment in his term of the West around Russia. You saw in 2008, NATO sat down in Bucharest. They looked at the map and they had offers from a comprador sort of leadership in both Georgia and Ukraine. But even then, the likes of Sarkozy and Merkel at that time looked at it and thought, this is a step too far. This will have retaliation from Moscow. And indeed, you saw as such in Georgia. But Ukraine was a country in flux, like you've both said. There is a massive population of pro-Russians, people who consider themselves Russians, or even Ukrainian speakers who still see Russia as brothers and sisters. So there was not the currency for a totally westward-looking regime, if you will. And Yanukovych was the middleman. He was the man who looked both east and west. And that was okay for Russia. Russia, as long as there was someone in Ukraine on their borders who wasn't ardently hostile, that's okay. And that makes sense in the geopolitics of any nation. If you've got someone hostile there, you're going to react. You're going to try and sit down and deal. But when you've got a player in charge of a country who is not hostile and is willing to talk to all sides involved, you can see from the Russians that was perfectly acceptable. And even Yushchenko before him, the Russians did not put troops on the ground. So the Russians have been, actually, if anything, accommodating of a situation moving forward. As you said, George, it did not start in 2014. It started before. I mentioned 2008. You go back to how Yushchenko came to power. I mean, in 2004, 2005, the Orange Revolution, or the Colour Revolution, if you will, shows that 2014 was not anomalous. Actually, 2014, in many ways, is just the typical CIA playbook in other countries, as we've seen even these past couple of years. You look in Pakistan with Imran Khan, how he's been replaced. So in that sense, 2014 is nothing strange in the playbook of Western imperialists. It's actually something rather typical. What is different is who it's directed at. Before, Iraq, Libya, various other countries, they were isolated nations. No one was coming to help. Russia has been a nation which has prevented the expansion of imperialism. It stood up to imperialism. It's also prevented, in my view, the visitation upon many countries, whether it's Venezuela, Syria, Bolivia, having the same treatment we saw in 2003 in Iraq.
We'll come back to some of those points, but let's get a different point of view from Dr. Stephen Hall, who is the assistant professor in Russian and post-Soviet politics at the University of Bath. Dr. Hall, welcome to the show.
Thank you, George.
Doctor, was EuroMaidan a revolution or a coup?
For me, it was certainly not a coup. I wouldn't go so far as to say it was a coup at all. A revolution, perhaps not, because it didn't. A revolution involves changing the political elites, a la the French Revolution.
In your view, did these protests in 2014, in response to Russia's preventive counter-revolutionary practices, as some claim, or a US-NATO plot for regime change? Which of these, or both?
I would say that it's not a US-NATO-led plot for regime change. In terms of the Kremlin's preventive counter-revolution, that's an interesting concept, but I don't think it's relevant to understanding the EuroMaidan. This is purely Viktor Yanukovych having backtracked on signing an EU association agreement and being given or offered $15 billion by Vladimir Putin as a way to back out of it. This led to the protests, and this eventually led to Yanukovych losing power after he tried to repress those protests and the people power that came up with the EuroMaidan. In terms of it being a coup, as I said before, I think for me personally, it's very clear this simply was not a coup.
According to December 2013 polls by 3 different pollsters, between 45 and 50% of Ukrainians supported the EuroMaidan protests, while between 42% and 50% opposed it. So half the population were opposing it. The question is, where are that half of the population now?
Well, I think we're looking at a country in Ukraine that was involved in geographical cleavages. You've seen the map of the divide along the Dnipro River, the main river in Ukraine. On the west, you have a more pro-European polity. On the east, you have a more pro-Russian polity. I think that's changed now, and actually pro-European people have become a majority in Ukraine since what happened in the EuroMaidan, with the annexation of Crimea, the war in the Donbass, and of course, Russia's invasion on Ukraine.
In November of 2013, portentously as it turned out, Yanukovych concluded that the Russian offer was superior to the EU's offer, which wasn't, of course, then or now an offer to actually join the European Union, while the Russian offer was preferred by Yanukovych. The protesters, however, were chanting, "Ukraine is Europe." What did they mean?
Well, Viktor Yanukovych had moved slowly towards integration with the EU and signing an association agreement. However, as you mentioned, he backtracked at Vilnius in November 2013, having met Vladimir Putin, who had offered Ukraine a loan of effectively $15 billion. And certainly this is what sparked the small protests by a group of young students, effectively, who felt that Yanukovych had taken away their future. They wanted European integration. And the protests for the EuroMaidan initially were very small. And then Yanukovych decided to repress those protests and to take the people off the streets as quickly as possible. And he did this very brutally. And this led to a spiral in the number of people coming out to protest against Yanukovych. And that's where I would say the EuroMaidan changed to a great extent. And this is the development, possibly we can talk about it being a revolution, the revolution of dignity.
Now, there were many reports at the time, not so often reported now, of ultra-right violent groups active in the Maidan 2014 events. Who were they, and how did they come by the kind of hardware that they were able to deploy on the square? According to the police, of course, the protesters were the first to use weapons. Who supplied that equipment?
Well, I mean, from my own research, I would get, these two groups are generally seen as Pravy Sector and Svoboda. Pravy Sector is it's not an homogenous group. It's lots of different factions who come under the banner of Pravy Sector, and they were opposed to each other, and it was very hard to lead them. Svoboda was more of a political party based in the west of Ukraine. Now, I would say from my own research that there is significant links to the Yanukovych regime and Svoboda, but also to Pravy Sector as well. We can see that people like Andrei Klyuyev and Sergei Lavochkin were actually funding Pravy Sector and were supporting it during the protest to act as agent provocateur. And that is certainly the case for Svoboda as well. That this was a way Svoboda were used effectively to paint the opposition as a group of far-right nationalists. Now, I'm not saying that there weren't far-right groups on the Maidan. There certainly were far-right protesters, but they accounted for, at best, 3,000 people out of a protest that saw numbers rise to somewhere between 400 to 800,000, depending on sources. So they are a small minority. They were just very vocal. And there's certainly close links with them, with the Yanukovych regime and the SBU, the Ukrainian Security Services at the time. So that's where I would say that this idea of a far-right coup is certainly overplayed. The far right was used as agent provocateur by Yanukovych. The coup simply, in my opinion, does not hold water. It wasn't a coup. As I said, Yanukovych, this created this spiral, led to him leaving. We also know that he'd started packing on the 19th of February before he actually fled. We also know that if you bear with me, when it came to him fleeing on the 21st of February, he disappeared. He didn't answer his phone. It was very hard to find him. And so the Verkhovna Rada held a special meeting to try and decide what to do, because there was nothing in the constitution. What happens when the leader leaves? And I'm not saying that there wasn't some three-quarters majorities. The constitution requires 338 MPs voting to impeach Yanukovych, but 328 out of 450 MPs did vote. And this was across all factions, all political parties in the Verkhovna Rada, and they voted to remove Yanukovych. So it wasn't necessarily, it certainly wasn't a coup, it wasn't an impeachment, but it was a change of power by consensus from all political factions.
Well, don't say we don't give everyone their say. It is Kalimahora after all. I'll be right back. You're watching Kalimahora with me, George Galloway, on Al Maidan television, coming from London, but talking about the Ukraine. James Randolph, filmmaker, broadcaster. Before the break, we heard, I felt, a somewhat unacademic dissertation from an academic. I felt it was dissembling. I felt it was, well, frankly, misleading. What did you think of his description of the events that led to the fleeing of Yanukovych? Turns out that his phone just ran out of battery. No one could get in touch with him. So they had to, what else could they do? Replace him. That was essentially the thesis of the learned doctor.
Well, it's ahistorical. It's not a true reflection of America's involvement in the Ukraine. It doesn't reflect, he didn't mention by name John McCain, the late John McCain appearing in the square.
In the square, yeah.
Inspiring.
Newland was in the square.
Victoria Newland was in the square. But we should go back a bit further, just so that viewers do understand. Ukraine was targeted by the fledgling CIA in 1946. According to their own documents, it's on their own website, you can check it if you wish, to target Ukrainian nationalists, to stir up animosity against the Soviets, to undermine communism. The beginning of the real Cold War was the front line of Ukraine. So 1946, they reached out, and all of the displaced people, all of the former Nazi regime activists, the people that took part in the massacres of Baba Yar and the
Holocaust of the East,
the industrialization of the massacre of Jewish people in Europe, were tools of the CIA. As is evidenced on the CIA website, where you can see at length, this was American policy at the time. As declassified papers in 1998, you can now read that yourself. Hit the fast forward button to then, you have a president in waiting, Poroshenko, who is a pawn of Viktor Pinchuk. And from 2013, 2014, Victoria Newland and Viktor Pinchuk were pulling strings effectively. Viktor Pinchuk is an oligarch whose fortune was made on the post-Soviet industries. He came from pipe making, heavy industry, basically. Now, Ukraine is one of the most mineral-rich countries in Europe. It has coal resources, it has industry, as Edward alluded to earlier on. In the sidelines is Poroshenko, soon to be the president of Ukraine, under the auspices of Viktor Pinchuk. Viktor Pinchuk is glad-handing around Europe. He's Europe and America. So in his Yalta conference in 2013, he has Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton, Tony Blair, Shimon Peres. He has major world players at his conference in Yalta. Now, most of us in Europe think of Yalta as perhaps the famous meeting of Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt. But there was a key meeting in 2013 where Tony Blair started getting bankrolled. His Faith Foundation, his institute, the word institute, his Tony Blair Institute, bankrolled, as is in a report in the London Financial Times, which makes clear, was funded by Viktor Pinchuk. So this is a mixture of a lot of money and a lot of important people. The events in Maidan were the conclusion of many years of planning.
Yeah, a long time in the making. Robert, your scholarship I'd pitch against Dr. Hall's any time, and we shouldn't dwell too much on it, but the chain of events that he described, well, he described them rather implausibly, didn't he?
Oh, absolutely. There was a great deal of violence which was projected from these anti-Yanukovych protesters, people who were working in the interest of getting Ukraine into the EU's orbit, which has been disastrous and led to even massive depopulation of that country. And, of course, working in the interests of the United States, which wanted, of course, Ukraine out of the Russian orbit, whereas, of course, Russia would have been sort of happy with or tolerate Ukraine's neutrality. That was part of the agreement that was originally signed, that Ukraine would be neutral between Russia and other countries. That's what was a part of their agreement to give up their nuclear weapons. Their neutrality has been violated, and since then all bets were off. And of course Russia naturally moved into Crimea and a war started in the east. But of course what happened in the EuroMaidan, though the protests were incredibly violent. Indeed, 100 people died. They were killed, shot, and of course this was done to discredit Viktor Yanukovych's presidency. They were shot with rounds that didn't belong to, that were not used by his riot police, and it was actually estimated that 100 protesters had to die to discredit the regime. And Baroness Catherine Ashton, the EU special representative, in a sense the EU's foreign minister, investigated this, and her calls were bugged and of course naturally released to the world, released to the media, and she had said that the shooting actually came from the Opera House. The Opera House at the time was under the control of what she described as the new coalition, which was the anti-Yanukovych forces, the coup, the putsch forces. So the bloodshed was committed by them to put the blame and to undermine a peace deal which had been agreed between Viktor Yanukovych, the Klitschkos and other actors within Ukrainian politics. That couldn't be allowed to stand. The European Union and United States wanted 100% of Ukraine. They wanted it in their orbit. They were not willing to negotiate with Russia. Of course, Russia did take part of the east in terms of Crimea. And of course, there would have been interference in Donetsk and the Luhansk, with creating the People's Republics in those areas. But of course, the European Union and the EU have grabbed Ukraine, grabbed its resources, and of course, naturally, the country's now devastated, and because really they led Ukraine on a path that eventually led to war. Everything about Ukraine now that we understand about the fighting, about the dreadful bloodshed, the invasion, it all comes down to the legal change of government, the bloodshed that was committed on the streets of Kiev and in other places, Lvov, for instance, the bloodshed that was committed there, and really forcing a large section of the Ukrainian population to be in the remit of foreign influences which they did not support, and whereas Ukraine, its only future is as a neutral country. And that may indeed be the final outcome when the peace agreement that's been on the table since before the invasion, and it was agreed essentially agreed in Israel when there was negotiations at the start of the conflict in the recent fighting in 2022, that agreement will probably come to pass and will be enacted. So this continuing war is really only helping those who profit from this dreadful fighting and this murder.
You called it illegal. Even Dr. Hall conceded that it was not constitutional, although he denied that it was a coup. I'm not sure how a transfer of power, which you accept is unconstitutional, did not have the three-quarters majority, can be described as anything other than a coup. But let's get another perspective, this time from Ottawa in Canada. Professor Ivan Kachanovsky. He's the professor at the School of Political Studies in the University of Ottawa. Professor, welcome to the show.
Thank you for the invitation.
Professor, what's your understanding of the protests that happened on the Maidan in 2014?
Yeah, I researched the Maidan since I was watching this live, because I specialize in political violence in Ukraine. And I published peer-reviewed articles about this, presented to major academic conferences in the US and Canada and Sweden, and also published a book chapter and now writing a book on this topic. So I can say that based on my research, I can say that Maidan was a complex event which involved mass protest, which was very visible against the government, which was relatively pro-Russian and was led by Viktor Yanukovych, but also it had element of political revolution. But I think most important event which is not yet widely understood correctly was Maidan massacre, which and the transition of power in Ukraine, which can be considered to be called a coup, and also element of regime change.
So, revolution or coup, which best describes those events?
I think often Maidan is called a revolution of dignity, but this name or this term for Maidan was invented by a far-right politician, a member of the Svoboda party, a member who was actually also a member of Ukrainian parliament. So this is kind of from political science perspective, there was an element of revolution, but I think most important was Maidan massacre, which was not a mass event. This was mass murder which was organized and conducted by a very small number of politicians within Maidan opposition, and it was used specifically to overthrow the Ukrainian government. So in this case, this was more significant element of a coup taking place in Ukraine during the Maidan, and because absolute majority of Maidan protesters did not participate in this Maidan massacre, they were not even aware about what happened. But according to my research, evidence is overwhelming that this was a false flag mass murder, specifically to kind of implicate the current then incumbent government of Ukraine, led by Victoria Newland, and to seize power in Ukraine. This was successful, but there was also involvement of the United States in this case in the form of regime change in Ukraine.
Did you, in your research, turn up any foreign intervention in these events?
I think this is still a big question whether there was this was internal decision by the Maidan opposition, elements of Maidan opposition, including oligarchic parties and far-right politicians like Svoboda and the right sector, to perpetrate and organize Maidan massacre and overthrow the Ukrainian government, or if there was, or if this was a part of U.S.-led regime change in Ukraine. Because according to admission, even by then President Obama, he said that the United States basically managed a political transition in Ukraine, brokered the deal, which led to political transition in Ukraine right after Maidan massacre took place, and before then President of Ukraine Yanukovych even fled Ukraine. And this, again, this was presented in the media and by Western politicians as basically that he fled Ukraine because he was responsible for Maidan massacre, but actually my research shows, and a lot of evidence shows, which was revealed by Maidan massacre trials and investigations and trial in Ukraine, that actually Yanukovych fled Ukraine because of assassination attempts against him, and this was the real reason, and he was not kind of responsible for this massacre.
There seemed to be, I suppose, some kind of misunderstanding, because many of these protesters in 2014 seemed to believe that the EU was offering membership of the EU to Ukraine, which was not true then and isn't even true now. How would such a misunderstanding be explained?
In this case, this agreement did not involve any possibility of membership in the European Union for Ukraine. And specifically, European Union then rejected even mentioning in this agreement that Ukraine would be potential member of European Union if it would fulfill all conditions in the future. So this was, I think, kind of agreement which did not involve EU membership, but a lot of people actually believe that this would be the case, that Ukraine would join the EU, and they blame Yanukovych for this. Even so, actually, when even agreement was signed, there was no any kind of membership process for Ukraine until the start of Russia-Ukraine war.
Who were these violent far-right groups, neo-fascist groups, neo-Nazi groups in 2014? What was their involvement in these events, and how have they prospered since 2014?
Yes, this is an issue which I also research. I specialize in research in far-right in Ukraine, and based on my research and based on evidence, the involvement of far-right in mass protests was relatively small if you compare just numerical membership or numerical representation, because they were small in terms, they were just a few thousand members of far-right organizations. But far-right had a very crucial role in this violence during Maidan, specifically during the Maidan massacre of the police and protesters, and this is why they they also enjoy such immense influence or significant influence after the Maidan. Even so, Ukraine is not a United States as Russia kind of claims in order to justify its invasion, but far right is much more influential compared to its membership, and the reason for this is because of their involvement in the Maidan massacre and overthrow of the Ukrainian government in 2014.
Edward, again, we have a difference of opinion about the numbers and the quality of the intervention by the far right. Dr. Hall counted only 3,000 far rightists in the Maidan out of what he said was between 400,000 and 800,000. And moreover, those 3,000 were in organizations effectively in the pay of the government that they managed to overthrow, which, if true, was a very poor investment on the president's part. That would be surprising, though, because by the time we get to 2022, in and around Mariupol, for example, there's an entire regiment of far-right fighters wearing Nazi insignia and colours and so on. So if Dr. Hall was right and there was only 300 at the beginning, how did they grow so large in the interim? Or was he not right about the role played by the far right in the Maidan in 2014?
Well, if it's the numbers he suggests, it's a truly Spartan achievement that they got around so much of Ukraine and achieved so much for their payroll masters. You know, whilst you had the ongoing Maidan protests in Kiev, you know, a handful of months later, you've got the likes of the Odessa massacre, where they successfully, you know, penned in thousands of trade unionists, socialists, others. But then, as you say, it goes on from there. You have the achievement of the creation of whole regiments. And the reality is that for years, the likes of Victoria Newland and her lackeys within Ukraine, whether that was the billionaires who were bankrolling these groups, the likes of Svoboda, a lot of money was going around. They reckon in the region of 5 billion was spent in achieving this in the years leading up to Maidan. But as I suggested earlier, you know, they had a perfect storm, unfortunately, that the economy, and this is what these gentlemen failed to mention time and time again, is the economy in Ukraine was crashing. 2013, Ukraine was 100 billion in debt. And the real cliff face at the end of 2013 was part of the deals that would be being spoken about with the EU, but also with the World Bank and the IMF, was a bailout of 15 billion. But the bailout that was suggested by the West, by the IMF, by the World Bank, was with stringent conditions, as it always is. First and foremost was the legalisation of the selling of land. Now, the bankrollers of the likes of the Azov Battalion and co, of course, want to be able to buy more land. It secures more so their oligarchy. The second was the ruining of conditions for those who had pensions, slashing pensions, raising the pension age. The third condition was the ceasing of subsidies on oil, other fuels. Now, Russia came in and gave an alternative view. That was 15 billion, no conditions, and you know what were, if possible, make the oil flow a bit cheaper for you. Of course, Yanukovych went for the latter deal. To those who had spent years, as I say, under Yushchenko, gaining strength, building up in dark corners, and then under the leadership of Yanukovych, grew even more emboldened, had more money thrown at them. You know, you can imagine the jackboots in the streets, down the alleyways, recruiting people. This was all on mass media. In the wake of 2014, it was recorded by the BBC, by CNN, by Channel 4, that these fascist thugs had recruited not a couple of hundred, but several thousand, tens of thousands of young men, unemployed men in the large, to Svoboda, to the right sector, to various other groups, whether it was Klitschko's Udar group, Tymoshenko's Fatherland Party. And it is there in British mass media as well, for everyone to see.
Sure.
Only a couple of years ago.
You'll not be on the British mass media. Some of these other experts will be. Perhaps that's the difference. Robert, was this all entirely predictable? I mean, to me, looking back at it, it seems obvious. I did not have the level of close attention and expertise back then as you evidently did, but from this vantage point, it looks like this was all entirely predictable and therefore could have been avoided. We might not have a war. We might not have hundreds of thousands dead. We might not have Ukraine effectively now partitioned. We don't even know the final demarcation of that partition. It may be the entire south and the entire east from the Dnipro end up not in Ukraine at all, and Ukraine may well be left with a Western European rump, a kind of Kosovo dependency.
Well, yeah, indeed, most of the industry is in the east, so that which is under Russian control at the moment, or part of the People's Republic, that's where the wealth is. The West will be dependency on the European Union, and indeed, of course, it's a source of cheap labour. That many, millions of people have actually left and gone to the European Union and the UK.
And they're not going back.
Absolutely not. No, the country's devastated. And of course, people, there was always part of the desire for many people to be able to leave Ukraine. So we're in a situation which is, if a government kills its own people one day, the next day they are citizens of another country. The same thing happened in the east of Ukraine, and it encouraged the separatist movements, which were people who were just saying they wanted autonomy. And this was entirely predictable, so predictable, one suspects that there was actually a desire to see this come to pass, to suck Russia into a war. Perhaps this is what some people speculate. And after the EuroMaidan, after the change of government, and after the bulk of Ukraine had been firmly in the Western orbit and receiving equipment, military equipment, not formally a part of NATO, but receiving military training, military advice, military equipment, really compatible from the boots to the firearms upwards from NATO countries. People could see what was happening, and it's so predictable. One suspects that there's an agenda there, that some people want this conflict. And indeed, as I mentioned earlier, a peace settlement was available before the invasion started on the 24th of February 2022. Of course, the Minsk agreement after as early as 2014 and 2015 could have had an end to the fighting that was in the east, where there was, in a sense, largely a popular uprising, although with some support from volunteers from Russia in some cases. There's been many opportunities for peace, and they've all been stamped down at every opportunity by people saying to the leaders of the Kiev regime, as it is at the moment, we'll back you in the war. You must keep fighting. And partly responsibility for the bloodshed will rest with those who've stood in the way of peace and encouraged this situation, which was so obvious. One suspects they wanted this to come to pass, perhaps.
They wanted this to come to pass. Let that be the epitaph of this particular episode. They got what they wanted, and the poor Ukrainians are paying the price. I've been George Galloway. You've been a marvellous audience. Thank you for watching. Kale Mohora.